Lesson 5, Africa. Let's begin by looking at the pictures on the front slide. Here we have beautiful African clothing and color in the clothing, jewelry, hairstyle, and tradition. Now, I like these two pictures a lot. One, because it shows nice native African culture, but also, if you look at the picture on the left, there might be something that you notice. If you paid attention to the picture, and you can see the man using the flip phone, I like this picture because it shows a nice blend of traditional African culture along with technology. Now, let's discuss physical Africa. As we move through the presentation, please follow along with your guide. The Sahara Desert is the largest desert region in Africa in the north. The Sahara Desert wasn't always a desert region. This region was also called the Green Sahara by archaeologists that existed about 2500 BC. So almost 5,000 years ago, this land was vibrant and had savanna and animals and people living there. And the reason why we know this is because we have found cave paintings of different things, animals teeming across savanna grassland and so forth, people living there and recording history, evidence that they lived, fossils that they lived in this region. The Kalahari Desert is going to be our desert for the south. If you've ever seen the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, you might remember when we did world languages and we looked at the Sochi people's language and the clicking noises, and this is the same group of people. The Kalahari Desert is in the south. The Sahel is the western part of Africa, and the interesting thing about the Sahel is that the Sahara Desert is actually growing and overtaking parts of this region. The Nile River, which flows north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea, two main tributaries being the White and the Blue Nile. Lake Victoria, you can see here, is the largest freshwater lake in Africa. The Great Rift Valley, you can see with the picture here to the right, and then the diagram with the orange line on the map on the left. The Great Rift Valley is a series of giant fractures or cracks in the Earth's crust. And you can see the long skinny lakes, those are rift lakes, areas where the rift has actually filled with water and become really narrow, skinny, but deep lakes. Now, climate zones. If we could take Africa and if we could fold it in half, you will notice that the climate zones are symmetrical or reflective. So you have rainforest in the center, tropical savanna, grassland on either side, desert region, and then Mediterranean climate. So the vegetation and climate region. So while these vegetation zones and climate zones are symmetrical around the equator or rainforest, the final piece I'd like to point out to you is the island of Madagascar, which is located at the southeast corner of Africa and is a large island nation. Now, let's begin talking about political Africa. Africa, like many other regions in our world, such as Latin America and the Middle East, are plagued with political instability, militarism, revolution, and political unrest. And so Africa is really no different. It kind of follows that line. Much of Africa is unstable, and you have military regimes and dictatorships. You have large human rights abuses. But then you have other places that are pretty nice to visit. The wildlife reserves in Kenya are a beautiful place to visit. There are places in Egypt historically that are nice to visit. You always want to be careful when you're visiting other regions of the world. Be mindful of conflicts and potential negative impacts in that region that could occur while you're visiting. Now, human rights abuses, particularly against women in Africa, are common. Refugees, most of you probably already know what refugees or who refugees are, and these are people who escaped persecution by fleeing to another country, and it could be persecution under the law or religious persecution, gender, human rights violations, etc. Now let's move on to key terms. You follow along on your guide as I explain each term. Leaching is when it rains very much in the rainforest region and all the nutrients are washed from the soil. Therefore, you cannot really grow shallow plants or say farm areas in the rainforest because there's no nutrients in the soil. In the rainforest, the vegetation largely has deep root systems, and so that's why you're able to see all the vegetation. Now, because land can be scarce, we have this desertification phenomenon. Farmers in the region may practice slash and burn agriculture, and this is kind of a negative impact on the environment because it's deforestation. It's the rainforest getting smaller. And slash and burn agriculture is a way to solve the problem of leaching in the rainforest, and that is you cut down the rainforest, trees and vegetations, burn it, which releases nutrients and minerals into the soil, and then you can farm there. Now, the problem is you cannot repeat that process very much in the same area of land, so you have to cut down a different section of the forest and then burn it, and then farm for a little bit, and then move on and repeat. So it is very detrimental to the environment. Now, subsistence farming is approximately what 80 to 90% of the people do in Africa, and that is just farming enough for you to sell. So you don't have a surplus to really take to the market to make much money, but you can get by okay for the most part with your subsistence farming. Sedentary agriculture allows you to not be nomadic and move around, but to stay in one area because you are using maybe chemical fertilizers. So things that maybe not average, ordinary Africans can maybe purchase, but larger corporations or larger farms and farmers could maybe practice sedentary agriculture because they have the means to buy these sedentary things like the fertilizers and so forth. And then desertification, if you look at the two pictures to your right there, the top one being deforestation and the bottom one being desertification, you can see the desert region taking over parts in Western Africa and the Sahel, where once you had towns, now you just have desert. And so that's an issue as well. Now, economically speaking, I'd like you to jot down one or two crops, one or two animals that are herded, resources that are prevalent in Africa, and also languages. Just simply write that more than 2,000 languages are spoken in Africa. When we looked at world languages, we saw that about 6,500 were spoken worldwide, so 2,000 of those just on the continent of Africa alone. Now, culture, I'd like to talk to you about animism and ancestor worship. Animism is simply believing that ordinary things in nature, etc., contain spirits. And so when we watch a video called The Power of One, we'll see that there are things in nature like water, rain, waterfalls that have spirits. And ancestor worship is not so much worshiping your ancestors, but rather calling on their spirits to give you guidance and help. Now, many societies and communities are matriarchal, which makes Africa somewhat unique from the Western Hemisphere, is that they're not patriarchal. So they're led by the eldest female, or the female might be the leader in the community. Now, let's talk about conflicts in Africa. So some big things here. We have the AIDS issue worldwide with Africa. The United States sends a lot of money globally, or rather yearly, to Africa to help with this, purchasing medicines and supplies and sending doctors and so forth. Lots of mythism. Mythism is important part of culture in Africa. So we see that with animism and ancestor worship. But myth is a big way that misinformation is spread, in particular about how AIDS is transmitted person to person. Now, many countries, because they are politically unstable, are third world countries, so they lack things that you and I enjoy, such as access to medicine, clean water, even though if it's not that tasty coming out of the water fountain, that it's fairly clean, cleaner than you might find in Africa, that you're sitting here educating yourself, you have that availability and technology, and also food. Now, South Africa and apartheid is one special case that we're going to kind of focus on as we end our unit in Africa eventually in another week or so. We're going to be viewing the movie called The Power of One, in which we will be able to really look at the system of apartheid in South Africa. And apartheid, I want you to write down on your video guide, is a government system of racial discrimination against the black South African population in South Africa by the Dutch and the English. And so the video we're going to watch, the movie, is called The Power of One, and it really portrays this well. I think you'll enjoy it. The system of apartheid was very brutal, killed lots of people who were activists or spoke out against that government system. And South Africa is still healing following that apartheid government system. So it's very brutal, very bloody, and very much a part of discriminating racially against the black South African population by the European colonizing group that came in a couple hundred years earlier. So this concludes our lesson 5. Thank you for listening. And the backside, the Proverbs of Africa, will be something that we will do in class, so no need to do that part. Thank you.